All right, all right, all right. Okay, Jeremy, tell us a little bit about your background.
Yeah. My background is I've kind of had an evolution here that I suspect we'll talk about, but I think a lot of people are going to go through this evolution. So my background is mostly like formally on the data science side. That's where I started my career, working like the health tech space, data science, working in NLP back before it was cool, using Spacey and things like that, like actually training models. Had this experience at that company where like we were a relatively small data science team. There were like three or four of us. I think I was the second data science hire in a relatively large engineering org at a very well established like multi-billion dollar company. And I had this experience of like trained a model and wanted to then deploy that model, and that we just never done that before. And we did this classic thing where it was like we partnered with the consuming engineering team. They like took the model object. I had written all this stuff in Python. They deployed it in Java. And so now I had this model in a code base that I didn't have access to, couldn't update, like couldn't monitor all this kind of stuff. Just like not a great deployment experience for anyone. So I just naturally was like, okay, if we want to be like a successful data science ML team, we need to pay more attention to like our ML ops infrastructure and like how do we actually like build production systems that we like serve internally. So from there, from that data science role, I shifted more into like what you would call a machine learning engineering role, which was spending a lot more time on like our ML infrastructure and importantly, like how we serve models to other teams. So we
Love it.
transitioned, built out our whole infrastructure and started getting to a mode instead of doing like handoffs with engineering teams. We would host models on our side. We own the infrastructure end to end and just serve it via API to whatever downstream consuming teams they want. By the time I left that company, we were serving, I think, 20 models in production on that infrastructure.
Wow.
Continued to like do a lot of NLP work there, training a lot of models. Specifically, like we had a lot of like textual data that we were trying to make sense of. So training a lot of models on that textual data, like these actual, you would call now a foundational model, right? Like training them from scratch rather than like a pre-trained model, and doing a lot of work with embeddings and stuff like that. When the GPT-3 moment happened, everyone was like, hey, we need to do something with this stuff. And I was naturally like being at this intersection of like an MLE and doing a lot of this NLP model work, was like well equipped for that. So I transitioned to like leading our Gen AI development efforts and spent about a year and a half basically just trying to figure out like, hey, how do we build Gen AI systems? How do we productize this, all this kind of stuff? From there, I then transitioned to an earlier stage startup called Freeplay, which is basically I felt this whole like space of problems, which is like building with LMs is a much different problem than like traditional machine learning engineering. And there's this whole host of problems that I think there's like this new LM development life cycle that is this mishmash of the classic SDLC and like ML ops into this new thing. And it felt like I know we as an ML AI team, like didn't have a good way to approach that problem. And what Freeplay is trying to do is like be, the platform to help solve that problem. So that's why I was enticing. I joined Freeplay, started on the engineering side and well doing a lot of like technical work with our customers and what we call like forward deployed engineering, and then have since shifted into more of a product role. So I really like run this gamut from data science all the way now to being more product oriented. So what Freeplay is meant to be is an end-to-end single pane of glass for building LLM powered features for product teams. So digging into what each of those things means, starting with the like end to end, is we are not so much playing on the like model training side of things, right? Our assumption is most of our teams, maybe they have like a fine-tuned OpenAI model or something like that. But for the vast majority of the case, they're accessing these models via API, whether that be like Azure Bedrock, but they're not generally like traditional ML models that they've trained. They're accessing these APIs, and they now want to build something to serve their customers. And that's where Freeplay comes into play. And so we have all this functionality around prompt management and versioning, experimentation and testing, evaluation, observability. That's all native built for building with LLMs. And the other part of that, like built for product teams, is we are very focused on enterprise product teams as opposed to individual developers. So while it's like a lot of other tools in the space are like, very much developer tools, our thesis is that for like companies to be successful building with LLMs, there's an opportunity here, which is that the traditional SDLC, right? You have like your product people defining what to do, your engineers doing it. Maybe you have like QA like evaluating things on the back end. But for the most part, it's the engineers who are doing the hands-on work day to day. And what we've felt is like with these LLM systems, when the IO is often like text in, text out, and importantly, like very domain specific. Oftentimes when it comes to prompting, evaluation, like the engineers aren't actually the right people to be spending their time doing that. Like their job in a lot of cases, and this is a generalization, is to like do the engineering, right? Like make sure all these things fit together. But then oftentimes it might be a product person who can help with prompting, or like a domain expert who can help with evaluation. And so we think that the LM development lifecycle, when done right, is far more collaborative in a hands-on way than the traditional SDLC was. And that requires like a new set of tooling. So we're really building for the product team as a whole, as opposed to just the engineering department.
Is that like, does that come from a shift in perspective of like who's going to have ownership of the LLM or this like type of role? Or is it, yeah, it does. So you've probably seen this come from like, I think we've talked about this before, but I think early on when LLMs are kind of like first coming out, these interfaces like obviously like ChatGPT or Anthropic and all that stuff started getting released. You saw like a lot of the data science work get handed from the actual data science team to kind of like product engineering team, right? Do you see that as like potentially shifting again into like more like the product people's hands or like another team? Or is it going to be like a whole new paradigm of a role? Or
I think the product engineering team is the right organizing principle to think of, which is like this is a collaborative effort between product engineering. And then like usually the thing that's kind of new is rather than like QA in the traditional sense of like a QA engineer, you have this new role of like the domain expert, which is like someone who just knows the customer well and can like actually evaluate the output of the system well. I had this experience at my previous company, which is like it was all healthcare data. And so I'm building these systems, doing the prompting, trying to evaluate them, and I have no idea what I'm looking at, right? Like I need the actual experts to come in and help tell me like what is good and what is bad. So that's the organizing principle we think of as like the product engineering team as a whole.
interesting. And so like in that discipline, do you see kind of product management going away entirely? Like it's going to be product and engineering kind of in one role, or does that make sense as a question?
Yeah, I think
Okay.
it's still two separate roles. Like I think there's actually even more of a role for product people. In fact, I think this is like we'll get into it later, but a big opportunity set, which is like everyone talks about the AI engineer, right? And like we can define that, which is like it's basically like this some hybrid between like an ML engineer and a normal software engineer, like meet in the middle. What the AI product manager is someone with all the like product expertise and product skills, but someone who is like knows AI well from a practical perspective.
Mm-hmm.
I think the only mod here is like all that person's experience is really important, but they need to now have a deeper understanding of how does building software change in an LLM world? And then how does the role of a product person change? Which is like, you now have an opportunity to not just be writing tickets and defining product, but actually like contribute potentially in like a hands-on way to prompting or experimentation or whatever that might be.
Kind of like almost like getting you from 0 to 1 more quickly, right? And then from there, hand it to people who can kind of fine tune either like even the prompts and or like the engineering kind of behind the scenes, right?
Exactly.
Okay, cool. Yeah, it's super interesting. Actually, a question I had for you that kind of is related, but I guess like there's like an old world of data science, which is kind of sort of like your traditional kind of ML approach, and where you're using like a very pointed kind of model towards solving a problem. Is there a world where, like, I guess from your point of view, like why use like these newer LLMs versus sort of like a pointed model and vice versa, right?
Yeah. So I think that there is still a huge role for like traditional machine learning, like which is a substitute for what you said, right? Like a pointed model. The thing with traditional machine learning engineering is it requires a significant amount of historical data usually. So when I was at my previous company, and granted I only spent like a year and a half on like post GPT-3 world, right? Like building these models. But by the point I said like we were serving 20 like custom built models in production by the time I left. And we had replaced exactly 0 of those like production models with a Gen AI solution. And it was because they're solving different problems, which is like all of those models we built because this company's been around for 20 years, we had 20 years of historical data at our fingertips to train new models with, right? So we had a huge data asset. If you have that, great. And like the things we were trying to do was classification, regression, these classic problems. But not every company has that data asset like that, right? And so that's where Gen AI can be more useful, is the barrier to entry basically goes down, and you don't need as much data to get started with. And there's also just different things you can build, right? Like if you're trying to do classification and you have 20 million rows of classification data, for the love of God, don't use a OpenAI model.
Yeah.
Like, go train a model. But if you're trying to do something, there's a lot more stuff that you can do that's just like different problems to solve. And so it depends on what problem you're solving. So I think there's a place for both of those things.
That's actually a good point. So like, do you feel like that may have been a reflection of like the actual product, right? Like you were working within kind of like the medical field, right? Or healthcare, a better way of describing it. Do you think that like that was probably partially related to that?
That is exactly what the diagnosis I would give it is. I think in
Pun intended.
general, this is like a generalization, but like Gen AI features require new things from a UX perspective. And we were often operating the constraint of like the UX is static. Let's just try and make the product do the thing it was doing before better. The example of that is like, we had a product that basically like, you're a hospital, you have what's called an item master, which is a list of all the items you purchased. And it's not deduplicated. The data is super messy. We would basically ingest your item master. We had all this historical data and we would enrich it and clean it up. And so that was the UX, and the UX was static. And so we used a whole host of like custom built models on the back end to do that like matching and entity resolution and cleanup and stuff like that. There was a whole nother set of things we could have done if it was in play to change the UX of that product from a Gen AI side. But working in the constraints of that UX, it was a better problem solved by like classical ML. And so I think like what Gen AI does is it opens up a whole new world of things you can build for your customers, assuming that you're going to like open the aperture of what you're willing to consider from a UX perspective for those customers.
Interesting. It's definitely, it's really interesting how you phrase it too, because I think it goes back to kind of like a first principles of product development, where like you shouldn't be like using a solution to chase a problem, right? Like you should look for the problem and then figure out what the best solution is there. Exactly. And that makes a lot of sense. And I think a lot of people are scared of kind of falling behind. So they end up taking the solution and try and chase problems with it. On a related note, I guess you're working with like a lot of large enterprises. You did in the past with the healthcare company, but you're also now with Freeplay, obviously working with a ton of enterprise companies. Like, what do you think are kind of the perceived risks from leadership in terms of AI adoption versus like the real actual day-to-day business impact?
Yeah. So I think it's like, I'll talk maybe just like initially a comment that maybe will get me in trouble with some people, but there's like a lot of talk about like AI safety and like fear of AGI. And I think it's true that the only people that feel that way are not people working in enterprise SaaS, because us in enterprise SaaS are just trying to figure out how to get the damn thing to work. And most of the time we can't yet. And so we're like, those things feel like so ephemeral to us, right? But I think in general, what I see enterprises do to shoot themselves in the foot is they think about, so they're not changing the way that they think about software development. So like traditional software development, you get the thing to work, you can test it definitively, and then you can ship it to production. And you can guarantee it has a constrained set of behavior for your customer. And what people are trying to do with Gen AI is basically shoehorn it into that same paradigm. And so they're trying to solve customer problems where there's no margin for error. And so if you're trying to solve a customer problem with Gen AI right now, where there's no margin for error, you're probably chasing ghosts, which is like, it's just not what you want to. What you want to do is instead think about like, what are things that we could do for our customers that would make their lives better and that there is a meaningful margin of error. It's like kind of a played out example, but something like Cursor, which is like an AI native IDE. Cursor is not worried about getting to 99% accuracy of the suggestions that they give me, because they built the UI from an AI native perspective, which is to say, if they are 60% correct, I feel awesome as a user, because it's like the way the UI is it's so easy for me to take what I want and ignore what I don't want. And so I think what enterprises need to do is stop trying to shoehorn it into this traditional way of thinking about software, take a step back and look at it differently to say, like, we now have basically like scalable intelligence that is imperfect the way a person is imperfect. What can we do for our customers that there's an acceptable margin of error they're willing to tolerate, and think about building those things first.
That's so interesting, because I mean, don't you think that puts the enterprise at like particular, like if I'm a leader of like a large, enterprise SaaS product, let's say, I already have sort of like a set of customers who have like a set of expectations. I want to implement these things because it helps them do their work faster. How do I balance that kind of like the need to shift into this new paradigm while also not kind of like totally breaking the customer expectations in terms of like how the product works and functions and all that stuff? Have you run up against that quite a bit, or like the...
Definitely. I think one of the, like, it sounds silly, but one of the like most useful things you can do is like sit down with your customer and say like, hey, if you had a magic wand that you were just using and waving throughout our product, what would you like use that magic wand for? And because what that is telling you is it's getting the customer outside of thinking of like B2B SaaS, like I need to describe my exact workflow to you, right? It's this more like nebulous thing of like, oh, if something was helping me do X, Y, and Z, it would make my life better. And when you like give it that framing, as silly as it sounds, what they'll describe to you is more creative work that by definition oftentimes has this built-in thing of this margin for error, which is like, right? Like
they're doing it, they're building in the margin of error for themselves, right? When they use, is that what you're saying?
Yeah, exactly.
Like when they're using the tool. Okay, gotcha. Yeah, I know it's really interesting because there's like a bunch of different products, and one of the things that I think can get slightly frustrating with AI products, or like, is that there feels like there's sort of like there's like two different products happening within like the same space, right? Like you have your CRM, and then you have like some sort of chat interface, but it's not like they're not really working together. It's, if I can't figure out this said problem within the CRM, I'm just going to go to this chat interface and talk to it like I would a customer support rep, right? Like, and I don't necessarily want that, right? I want it to like kind of solve the problem for me. I've seen good models for this, like Zapier does a pretty good job, right? Like if you have something that breaks, it like kind of, it can help you work through the problem, right? But I have to believe that like these companies are having a hard time kind of converging those two worlds, right?
Yeah. I think that if you're generally speaking building a product that has a chat interface, 9 times out of 10, don't do that. Right? Yeah. It's
fair enough. Yeah.
And you're right? That's what everyone is doing. It's like, let me put this button that has a sparkle on it, or like, let me put this chat thing that has a sparkle on it to talk to my AI. And they all suck. We've all used them. There's some good ones. They almost all suck.
Yeah. I think they should have a red danger button. Don't go there.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The thing to ask yourself is like, I think the best manifestations of AI powered features are things where the average median customer would have no idea it's an AI powered feature, and they just experience something that feels a few notches above typical software, in that it's like doing more of the cognitive, it's taking a marginal amount of the cognitive load off of them and helping that experience feel just a touch magical. Those are the best experiences where people have no idea that there's even an LLM under the hood.
Totally.
I can give you an example of this in something that we're building, which is like, we have this part of our product where we're basically helping people craft evaluations for their prompts and their like LM systems. And we have this library of different evaluations that you can select from. And what we do is, that's not a hard-coded library. So what we do is we basically, like, you select one of these things, one of these evaluations from our library, and behind the scenes, we use an LLM We grab the prompt you're trying to evaluate. We grab a bunch of production examples, and then we pass in a sample of this like evaluation that you're trying to do. And we write this evaluator for you. And the experience of the user is not directly like, oh, I feel like I'm using an LLM. They just click the template and it shows them, it gives them an example implementation of that just feels uncannily accurate, right? And we're not telling them there's an LLM under the hood, but that's why it feels uncannily like accurate and specific to them, is because we're doing that customization.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's so interesting. Kind of taking a little bit of a turn here. So, and this question is kind of like particularly interesting from my perspective, just because I spent a lot of time in the cloud infrastructure space, and it feels like there's like parallels here. Like in terms of, I guess, as inference costs continue to drop, obviously we're seeing them kind of drop dramatically over the last like 6 months. Do you think there's still going to be an advantage for using multiple models, or do you think a lot of people are going to be able to get most of what they want out of a single model? Like, curious what your thoughts are there.
I think that there is an advantage to having the like infrastructure and test harness in place to be model agnostic, so that you want it to be really easy to try new models. And you want it to be really easy to basically test some new model against a model you're currently using to determine if it's better. Take it's somewhat topical, the DeepSeek example. Let's say you have a feature that's powered by like OpenAI's O1. DeepSeek comes out. You want to very easily be like, okay, let me test DeepSeek and see if I would get a cost benefit for the same performance, or just like a performance benefit at the same cost. And then I can just switch from there. And so there is nothing inherently good about being multi-model and multi-provider, but it is extremely valuable to be configured in a way from an infrastructure and testing perspective that you are theoretically multi-model. If you have that in place and you end up being all OpenAI, great. Like, that's fine. But you're at least not totally pinned to OpenAI for forever, right?
Gotcha. Yeah, no, it makes sense. And do you like looking and you're obviously, if you don't have to have an answer to this, but and no one really knows, like, what do you see as like potential hurdles in the future for companies who, like, let's say, end up using one model and feel like they're pigeonholed to that model? And do you feel like a company like OpenAI is going to put like hurdles in front of people for like switching? Will they put like switching costs on the customer, right? Like, in Amazon has costs for like switching from Amazon to Azure, right? Do you see that? Doesn't seem to be happening right now, really, but like, do you see that kind of happening in the future? And in what way will they kind of like add costs? Obviously they might not do this, but It's a good exercise in terms of like kind of de-risking your.
It doesn't seem like there's much surface area for them to do this the way there is with cloud infrastructure, because by definition, like anything you plug into and you're making stateless API calls to, which is the case for most of these model providers, right? There's not a lot of surface area for lock-in there, because you can just swap that thing out. I think the only
historical, right? No, I mean, like, there is some. I mean, like, if I use something like a ChatGPT, over time, it builds up historical context on me, right? And you can make more informed decisions, like as an agent, if I give it more information.
So here's an example I'll give of that I've like always tried to talk people out of. OpenAI has this thing called the Assistance API, which will basically, like, you can just upload all your documents to it and it will handle the retrieval component of your system and basically abstract away what we would traditionally call like retrieval augmented generation. So you're just like letting OpenAI handle the LLM side of it and the retrieval side of it. Really easy to get started, but now you've given them a dimension to lock you in on, which is like, now if you want to go switch to Claude, you have to now transition everything over. So in that case, what I would generally recommend people do is, that's fine if you want to use OpenAI for the LLM side, but build your own retrieval system using a vector database or whatever it is, and own that, so that you can then swap the model out on top of. And that way it's very easy to switch across model providers. So models are like, all these providers are trying to lock you in. Like, they're coming out with like their own evals or like their own observability, and all of that is a trap to lock you in. So it's
Mm,
like basically externalize the tooling to the provider and treat the provider as a stateless service that you make calls to. And if you just
yeah.
always think of that as your top priority, the thing becomes interchangeable.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think it seems like a lot of people are thinking about that right now, which is yeah, so it's relevant. I'm curious, so from your perspective, there's like so much to dig into kind of on like the AI front. Like as an early sort of someone who's like early in their career, right? They're looking to potentially join an organization and maybe they have a technical degree from college or whatever it is, right? They're looking at maybe software engineering, maybe like data analytics, all these different things. Um, what are some like good places to start in terms of like learning more about AI and like how like what are some good things they can learn to like bring that to a new employer, right?
I think the biggest thing I would say is build more, read less, which is like I hear so many people, or I talk to so many people that are like, can tell me the like most recent thing that came out, the theoretical implications of it, all this kind of stuff. And then when you like dig in a conversation with them, they've never built anything with any of this stuff that's meaningful. And they just end up being like, they sound like a chatbot that's just been like combing AI Twitter, right?
Yeah.
And so
Yeah,
that's
totally.
the number one thing is like it can feel overwhelming to have to keep up with like every new development, but there's a lot of core stuff that has staying power. And like for me, I have this experience a lot because like I'm still on the front lines working with our customers, and it's really important for us to be like as that frontline person to be like an expert in the room and a really trusted advisor. But what I don't do is have to convince myself like, oh, I have to have heard of everything that comes out, each week there's 3 different things that come out. The value that I bring is I've actually built these systems and I'm building these systems on a regular basis and have gone deep rather than gone wide. So like what I
Gotcha.
would recommend to people is like build something and go deep and don't worry about the breadth because the breadth is impossible to keep up with.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. On the talent front as well, I mean, how do you see AI impacting kind of the role of a data scientist specifically in the next few years? And we talked a little bit about it getting handed off to sort of like the product engineering, certain aspects of like Gen AI getting handed off to like product engineering. I think the data scientist role uh, has one that's been in flux this last year, ironically, right? Just because of all the new Gen AI advancements. How do you see that role kind of evolving in the next few years?
Yeah. So I need to caveat this answer with saying like
Mm-hmm.
I am a data scientist, right? We talked about my background. That's where I came from. So I'm going to say things that are a little bit controversial and may sound harsh to data scientists, but those are my
Send
people.
it.
That's where I started. I think that data scientists are at the most risk of this because what data scientists are used to the way they're used to working is there's generally no product expectation from them. They get to go off in a corner and kind of just like everyone's like, oh, look at those smart people over there. They're eventually going to produce some value. 8 times out of 10, they don't actually produce some tangible value. And oftentimes, data scientists they know a lot of math, they know a lot of theory, and they know very little engineering. And in a Gen AI dominated world, engineering becomes king and theory becomes much less useful. And so what people do is like those data scientists, in order to make the transition, need to start thinking about themselves as software engineers first with a data science background that allows them to help add structure to like the testing and the experimentation process and all of this. But the expectations for them are now going to be more focused around like, well, what can you deliver from a practical perspective? And so they need
Gotcha.
to basically upskill on the engineering side and importantly on the product side and get used to like building actual useful product that solves a customer problem rather than working on kind of like science fair projects off in the corner.
Yeah,
And I think that the engineers who are very focused on just like the analytics and the mathematical side of it are going to have a real problem going forward.
that makes a lot. It sounds like honestly, the resounding sort of message to me is that like you have to be a product oriented person. No matter what your role is, like you need to be thinking about it from the product lens and like how does it affect the end user, which honestly, I feel like you should always be thinking like that, right? But I think it's like now particularly pernicious to isolate yourself into like a corner and not talk to customers, not get closer to the product. Even if you're not talking explicitly to the customer, right? Like get close to the people who are actually talking to the customer so that you can be more informed about like how you're building things or like how you're framing the problem in your head, right? Yeah, no, that's super, super interesting.
Yeah, I think that this is like generally true. It's true for software engineers too, which is like it used to be the case that producing code was a highly valuable skill that you would get paid for. As code gen, I'm not saying this is the current state of the world, but code gen is going to get better and better to where the output of code is a commodity. And what becomes the skill is your ability to like orchestrate complex systems and importantly, solve customer problems. And the code generation part of it becomes, I think, a commoditized aspect. And you're no
Yeah.
longer, we're already seeing this a little bit, right? Like you're no longer able to pull as much value out of the market if you're a like mid-level, go sit in the corner, produce code. If you're a high level, like, really expert engineer in like distributed systems, the world is your freaking oyster right now, right?
Interesting. Yeah, yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Well, because you can provide value for a lot of people trying to manipulate and work with data, right? So that's so interesting. Yeah, and the way you frame that is also cool because I think it doesn't devalue the individual, and I think you see like I mean I've experienced this firsthand, but like you're working. I think it's really valuable to have an understanding of like the system and the problem before going and engaging an LLM, right? Because like you might not know what the right questions are, but if you have the baseline set, like you have a good understanding of like how code works, you have a good understanding of what your customers' needs are, and you have the right tool, you're going to be able to solve the problem very fast and efficiently. And like, honestly, the most importantly, you're going to solve it correctly.
Yes.
Right.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. So, it pays to like actually have an understanding of like how software works, even if certain parts of that role are commoditized, if that makes sense.
100%.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, I have one last question for you before you go. Are you team Anthropic or OpenAI? You have to answer. You cannot say both.
I'm going to
And I know this puts you in a terrible spot because you work on a platform that is tool agnostic. We'll remove this from the interview.
I am recently, as of the last couple weeks, team Anthropic.
Wow. Okay. We're going to hold you to it.
I'll give you a little industry vibe check here.
I love it.
I was at the AI Engineering Summit in New York this past weekend, and there were dueling workshops at the same time. One was Anthropic's Model Context Protocol, which is a new thing they've released. And then the other workshop was OpenAI's, and they were like talking about the real-time API and tool calling and stuff. Their rooms were set up. There's about 400 people that would be distributed across these. So each room was set up for about 200 people each. Anthropic's Model Context Protocol workshop was overflowing with like 300 people, and OpenAI's was relatively empty. Not to put anyone on blast, but I heard the OpenAI guys did it remotely too. Didn't even show up in person. So I think that
bad.
Things are in flux, but all I will say right now is I think Anthropic's got a fire in their belly and they're firing all cylinders.
I love it. I love a little competition. So this is great.
Yeah, it's good for everyone.
Yeah.
And I'm sure it'll change, right? OpenAI will drop GPT-5. It'll be awesome. But right now, Anthropic's got that momentum going.
I love it. I think that's all we got for now. Honestly, Jeremy, thank you so much for doing this. If there's anything like you want to leave us with in terms of like how to get in touch with you or even any little last tidbits about Freeplay, like let us know.
Yeah.
But yeah, this is really great.
Yeah, people can reach out to me for a whole host of reasons. Jeremy at freeplay.ai. I don't know where you're posting it, but feel free to post that.
Yeah, the entire internet.
Whether you're interested in Freeplay or if you're like this person that you described, which is like earlier in their career or even trying to make a career transition and they just like want someone to talk to and understand like how to think about this stuff. A lot of people did that for me at important points in my time. And I'd be happy to do that for other people too.
Cool. All right. Well, thanks again.